The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Merry meet everyone, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron's Masterclass. I see the professor is walking up to the podium. So, take a seat, get comfortable. The class is ready to begin.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to the Masterclass. Today's teacher is Sean Patrick O'Donoghue, and the subject is the Silver Branch and the Otherworld, Forest Magic with Plants and Fungi Allies. That's the name of his book, and that's the course. Now, Sean is a clinical herbalist, writer, and teacher who weaves together insights of traditional Western herbalism and contemporary science. He's a columnist for the Plant Healer magazine and founder of the Otherworld Wellhead School. So grab something to write with, because you're going to want to take some notes, and let's get started. Welcome, Sean. I have a couple of questions to get us started. I kind of really like backstory. So how did you first begin to connect with plants?
Well, there are in some ways two answers to that story, because when I reach all the way back to my childhood, in a world that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, I found refuge and solace in the forest and the swamp beneath my parents' house, and also in the woods on the shore of the lake in the Adirondacks where my grandparents spent their summers. And there I would feel something profoundly alive and deeply familiar reaching toward me. But I didn't really have a name or a sense for what it was, and I didn't really understand that it was coming from the plants and from the land itself. And so the path opened for me again after I had devoted much of my early adult life to activism and was working as an activist and as a journalist for human rights, and was in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, documenting the repression in the wake of an uprising, meeting with people who were hiding in church basements and hiding in the hills. And hearing their stories, I had my heart really broken open by their suffering. But I also heard them speaking of the way in which the Zapotec and Mixotec peoples were peoples of the corn, and that they and the corn had been one and the same for as long as anyone could remember, and those hills were the first places where corn was grown, and about how the land and the corn and their ancestors were what gave them the strength to continue surviving and continue resisting. And hearing that, I felt something profound, and I felt something that was profoundly missing from my own life and my own culture. And I began to feel that really, really stirring in me, that desire for that kind of connection that they were speaking of, that here I was coming from this place of comfort and privilege in relation to the lives of the people I was meeting, but they were experiencing so much more vitality and so much more meaning because they were living in the context of these deep relationships. And the night that I came back to the country, I ended up at a gathering in Boston where I felt really, really out of place. But there was one person who felt really, really different to me in the room, whose presence kept calling to me. And when we finally began to speak, she told me that she was an herbalist and that her work was with women on helping to reclaim their own body sovereignty, and that she was listening, and that she was learning from listening deeply to the plants. And as she spoke of that, I recognized that she was speaking something that had the same feeling as what I was hearing when I heard people in Oaxaca speaking about the corn. And so I was deeply, deeply intrigued and went back north to where I was living. Shortly thereafter, became sick. My lungs have always been my vulnerable organ. And in many systems of medicine around the world, lungs are understood as the organ that holds grief. And here I was carrying all this grief, both my own and the grief of the people I had just been with. And so I found myself first with bronchitis and then with pneumonia and really, really struggling. And then on New Year's Eve, a phone call came out of the blue from that herbalist who I had met in Boston. And she had tracked me down and wanted to talk. And after a really good conversation, we hung up. And then she called back right away and said, I didn't know whether to say anything, but I think I should. I was listening to your breathing, and there's a plant who can help you. And her name is elecampane. And she has a bright yellow flower and a deep resinous root. And she helps to pull up and release whatever you're holding on to in your lungs. And so I went immediately to the health food store on the other side of town that was open for a few more hours and got my first bit of elecampane tincture. And when I took the very first few drops, I felt something shift. And part of it was that the scent and the taste really invited me to breathe more deeply. But there was something else as well. That I had always had this story that my body was broken and flawed, and there was nothing that I could do that could change that. It was just my lot in life, and that I was just destined to ill health. And as soon as I took those first drops of elecampane, I felt that story began to unravel. And as I continued working with the plant, not only did it begin healing the acute infection that I was dealing with, but it began inviting me to breathe more deeply. And I would go out into the woods with my dog in the snowy spruce and pine forest and breathing in the scent of the trees, take it in so much more deeply than I had known that I could take in a scent, and feeling both that scent of the trees and the presence of the elecampane coming more deeply into my lungs and inviting my breath in more deeply, and with that breath, my coming more into my body. And so that began to shift my whole relationship in regard to my body. And it also began to shift my understanding of the world. That on an abstract level, I had had a sense that the world was alive. At the level of belief, I knew that the world was alive, that all of life was related to us. But feeling that kinship more intimately, it became more real and really began to transform me. And I just kept going deeper down that path.
That's a great story. Now, we talked a little bit, in the beginning, talked about the silver branch. And what is the silver branch?
In the Irish tradition, one of the oldest beings is Manannán, the god who is the son of the great sea of infinite being. And he was there long before anyone else was there in Ireland. But there was a time when a people came from the north, riding the north wind. They were the people who had left to go to the north to learn the secrets of the world. And in Irish, they're called the Tuatha De Danann. They're the people who, in English, are often called the fairy people. And having learned the deep secrets of the world, they understood how to call to the wind and how to call to the rain and how to call the flowers to blooming and call the forest to life. And so their life and their language and their music and their magic were deeply entwined with all of the life of the land. And they understood also how their kinship to everything and how to move through many forms across many lifetimes and hold that memory. When the people who had become the Irish people came sailing up from Spain, the Tuatha De Danann fled this world, went into another world, and descended into the ancient burial chambers and the deep lakes and the deep wells. And their descent was obscured by a mist as Manannán sang an enchantment that made their departure invisible and concealed the world that they entered into. But when they went into that world, they took with them magic and knowledge that were essential to the life of this world. And that would continue to be needed in this world. And so, over the course of history, to poets and healers and kings, Manannán would come sometimes across the waters, and he would come carrying a silver branch of an apple tree that had fruit and flowers and leaves all at the same time, because the way that he lived was outside of time and its ordinary sense. And when he shook that branch, you could hear the music that wove the world into being. And if you put that branch in your hand and you held it, you could see into the other world, into the depths of everything, into the well where all the waters of the world have their source. And so the silver branch is that gift from the other world that grants us the possibility of sight. And I've been influenced in my thinking about it very deeply by the late Irish philosopher John Moriarty, who spoke about silver branch vision as that vision in which that allows us to experience the sacredness of everything, because we see the depths of everything. We see the life within everything. And so I chose that title for my book because I feel that silver branch vision is what's required for us to see the way forward through these times and find our way back to who we are and who we evolved to be. And in order to truly connect with the rest of the living world, that's the kind of vision we need to enter into.
We definitely need to it, really, truly. All right, that's a good way to get started, and I'm going to take a step back. So the virtual podium will be all yours.
Well, I always like to begin by inviting people to come into presence and come into perception in a different way, in a way that's closer to that silver branch vision. And so I learned from my late friend Stephen Buhner that our heart is not merely a pump. In fact, it's not a pump at all. It's a drum that sets the rhythm of our life, and it's an organ of perception that just as our eyes take in the world in terms of the quality of light, and our ears take in the world in terms of the quality of sound, in the same way, our hearts feel the touch of the world upon them, and feeling the subtle shifts that come in the presence of the rest of life. They take in the world according to how the world feels. We experience the world through a deep intuitive feeling sense, through the perception of the heart. And this is how people all over the world first learn their medicines, first learn their magics, through the world speaking to them directly, speaking through the heart. And we can begin to reconnect with that by bringing our attention back to the heart, which is as simple as simply being with your heartbeat, feeling your heartbeat, and bringing gratitude to your heart. But because in our culture we are so disconnected from our hearts and indeed from our senses and our bodies, I have elaborated a bit further on what I learned from Stephen and from Julie McIntyre to invite people into arriving in a different way of being, in a different way of presence, in a different way of seeing. And so I invite you to feel the solidity of the ground beneath your feet. Feel your feet on the ground and feel the earth supporting you. Feel the solidity of your bones, how they hold you up. How your bones are at once solid like the earth, but also living, sensing, fluid like the earth. Feel how Earth's gravity gives weight to bone and flesh and blood. How the Earth's gravity draws you toward her core, holding you to her. Her gravity is her love. Feel the ocean of air that surrounds you. The air that you share with all who have ever breathed. With all who breathe now. With all who have yet to draw their first breath. And feel how your own river of breath connects you with that ocean of air. And as you draw in that river of breath, bring your breath and your attention and your hand to your own beating heart. Not to the thought of your heartbeat, to the feeling of your heart beating in your chest. And as you feel your heart beating, remember that your heart has beat for you in every moment of your life, without you ever needing to think, without you ever needing to ask. Playing out the rhythms of each moment, rhythms of joy and sorrow, rhythms of love and loss, rhythms of exile and homecoming. And as you think of all your heart has done for you, let gratitude rise up like the waters from a well deep within the earth. Let that gratitude rise up and flow through your heart and fill your heart, filling it to overflowing, washing over your heart, flowing into your blood that carries it to every organ, to every tissue, to every cell. As it flows to your lungs, let it infuse your breath. And as you breathe out, let that gratitude, let that blessing flow to all who share the ocean of air, to every being whose body that air passed through, every being that has ever drawn it, to all who breathe now, to all who have yet to draw their first breath. And as you breathe in again, receive their blessing in return. Bring that breath, bring that gratitude, bring your attention back to your own heart beating in your chest, in your body of flesh and bone and blood, held by the gravity of the earth. Supported by the solid ground beneath you. Tamadan Soanish. We are here now. Resituated in relation. Every traditional people in the world has understood the world primarily in terms of connection and relation. And in our culture, we have been trained to experience the world in terms of separation. We've been trained to see ourselves as simply contained within our bodies. Alan Watts called it the skin-encapsulated ego. And this has brought us a deep loneliness. A loneliness so deep that even our public health officials have begun to acknowledge that loneliness is a health crisis. But we're only seeing part of that picture, because we're beginning to pay attention to our loneliness for other humans, which is very real and very important, and there are kinds of kinship that can only be found with others of our own species. And certainly throughout most of history, most humans lived more deeply woven into family and community than we do now. And that very human loneliness is a hallmark of our time. But those communities that people lived within were always deeply connected with the land. And if we go back to our oldest ancestors, they lived in a world in which they were always hearing the call of the crow, the belling of the stag, the wind in the trees, in which every breath they drew in was filled with the scent of all the life around them, in which the water that they drank had filtered through the soil, had filtered through the roots of the plants, and become infused with their chemistry. And as such, they were never truly alone. Our nervous systems and our endocrine systems evolved in a world in which the rest of life was always speaking to us directly. And it still is, but we've lost the sense of how to tune into that. And it's become drowned out by a sea of electromagnetic and chemical noise that makes it harder for us to pay attention to those subtle signals. And we've been given the story that the rest of the world is material for human use, rather than our deep community, our deep family. And so I think that our deepest loneliness is our loneliness for the connection with all of the rest of life, with the plants, with the animals, with the stones, with the waters, with the ancestors and with the descendants, uh, with all of the rest of life. And when we begin to allow ourselves to invite that kind of connection back in, we begin to bridge that loneliness, and we begin to remember who we are, and we begin to reorient and find new ways forward.
I'm going to jump in for a second because there is a connection, between the spiritual and the mental and the physical health. So there's three things that get taken care of if we do the right thing, right?
Yes. And, it's only in the past 500 years that we've really thought of those as separate at all.
I mean, there's so connections too. I mean, also, between personal, cultural, and ecological healing. I mean, this, it's very complicated, but I think it's also very simple if you just kind of take away the stuff that's getting in your head and just going back and just think simple things instead of, how to get out of this and that, right?
Exactly. And so in our own individual healing, we are better able to show up for each other and better able to create the changes that need to occur. But we depend on a community of people and an ecological community in order to be alive and to survive in the first place. And so the health of all depends on the health of all.
Yeah, and we're too busy to know that, right? I mean, we're too busy not taking care of ourselves, but doing other things and losing a lot of health in any way.
Yes.
Scary, isn't it?
It is. And at the same time, the tree outside your door is still there. And the beginnings of that possibility of reconnection are so much closer and so much easier than we think, because we've just become so confused by all the noise.
So it's kind of like the old saying about stop and smell the roses, right?
Exactly. It is interesting because actually at a physiological level, when we do stop and smell a rose, the scent of that rose immediately signals our nervous systems in a way that causes us to relax tension, to breathe more deeply, to open all of our senses, and to have our hearts come into a calm coherence so that we can be in communication. So stop and smell the roses is the literal beginning as well as the metaphorical beginning.
Yeah, and I wonder if people really understand with this sense. Like I plant pink jasmine out back my back door, and every spring it comes into the house. And without even thinking about it, all of a sudden you get comfort. I mean, I love this thing. And people, are so busy not smelling the roses or jasmine or honeysuckle or whatever. I think it's important to be around plants and Mother Nature because she kind of heals us without even we knowing it.
Absolutely. And one of the wonderful things about scent is that we tend to filter what we see and what we hear through our preconceptions, and so we only get a part of what's coming in. But scent bypasses all of those filters and just creates an immediate visceral response in us.
All right, we got to take a quick break. That went kind of quickly. So everybody stay put, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Don't go away. There's more Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks right after these important messages.
Hi, this is Marla, and if you're enjoying tonight's masterclass and you want to hear it again, you'll be able to find it at the show's YouTube channel, which is Stirring the Cauldron Para X. And it'll be up there, well, forever. And you'll also find dozens of Stirring the Cauldron podcasts as well. And while you're there, why not subscribe? It's free. And whatever metaphysical area you're interested in, you'll find something to catch your eye, I'm sure. Well, thank you for listening in to tonight's class, and now I'll let you get back to your regular scheduled programming.
Do you know where the world's most secret bases are located? Do you know what spooky action at a distance means? Is there a conspiracy by aliens to prevent us from conquering space? And where is the best place in the United States to see a real UFO? Find the answers to all these questions and more in Mac Maloney's new book, Mac Maloney's Haunted Universe. Visit places you never knew existed, the Hampton Tunnels of Tokyo, the UFO Trail in South America, Ong's Hat, and the very mysterious M Triangle. Mac Maloney Haunted Universe contains hundreds of reports on ghosts, haunted planes and ships, weird celebrity deaths, mysterious sounds, and a breakdown of every monster in America, state by state. You've heard him talk about it on the radio. Now get all of Mac's paranormal research in one large volume, Mac Maloney's Haunted Universe, with a foreword by the very famous Juan Juan. On sale now in your local bookstore or on Amazon.com.
Hi, this is Marla Brooks from Stirring the Cauldron. One of the best gifts that you can give yourself or to someone else on your Christmas list this holiday season is the gift of insight. And if your crystal ball is a bit murky, think about giving them or yourself a personalized yearly Witch's Oracle deck reading. This comprehensive reading gives you a heads up on what the universe has in store for you in the coming year, and the month-to-month guide offers you a chance to make necessary changes if need be before situations get out of hand, or give you a hint of something really good to look forward to. So if you want to treat yourself or someone else, pop over to marlabrooks.com, click on the More tab on the homepage menu, and then click on Readings to find out more. And have a very happy holiday season, and blessed be.
Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
And welcome back. Our guest teacher tonight is Sean Patrick O'Donohue, and tonight's masterclass is The Silver Branch and the Otherworld. So I'm throwing it back up to you, Sean.
All right. Yeah, we've been given the story by our culture that healing is supposedly an inside job. And while it's true that at the level of our intention, at the level of our choice of engagement, our internal process is essential to the way in which we heal. It's actually only in connection that healing occurs. We are within ourselves these vast ecosystems of organs and tissues and cells, some of which are cells we would call human, and some of which are fungal and bacterial and viral cells that we call our microbiome. So we are within ourselves an ecosystem, contained in relational ecosystems, both human and wild, and within physical ecosystems. And so the work of our shifting our experience, the work of our shifting how we feel, the work of our shifting how we perceive, the work of our shifting our physical health, and in turn the work of shifting the culture within our families, within our own webs of relation, within our communities, within our nation, within our world, is dependent on our coming into that deep connection with the rest of life, coming back into communication, coming back into that memory of who we are. And it's interesting, a number of different scholars have used very similar language around the distinction between an indigenous worldview and a colonized or colonizer worldview, which is that in an indigenous worldview, the first layer of being is we. And I remember when I first heard that, feeling a certain degree of resistance to that, because I don't want to give up my individuality. But that's not actually what's that being asked or what's required to enter into that kind of worldview that most of humanity for most of history has been part of. Rather, we can look to the wild world and see examples of the way in which one can be I and we at the same time. And so I think in particular of the world of mushrooms and about how when we're walking along and we see an individual mushroom, we see it as though that's a distinct being. And that's true. That particular mushroom is having an experience in that moment that no other being is having in that moment, that no other being has ever had, that no other being ever will. But if we go beneath the surface, that mushroom is also an organ of another organism. It is the sensing organ and the fruiting body of a vast organism connected by slender threads that resemble and in fact are the evolutionary precursors to our nervous systems. These mycelial threads that weave together these many different fruiting bodies of mushrooms. And each of those fruiting bodies of a mushroom is having its own experience, but at the same time, woven into that mycelial network, they are part of a larger organism. So they are a we. And then we can take it further, because if we look at the relationships that mycelial organism has, it is woven in with the roots and rhizomes of all of the plants in its environment. And so, in addition to being a part of the mycelial organism, the mushroom is also part of the mycorrhizal organism, that entire web of threads woven together that forms the mind of a forest or the mind of a field, which in turn is influenced by the air and the water and the soil, and so is part of an entire organism that we call the earth. And so there are all these many, many layers of being. And we have all these many layers of being too. We are just used to only paying attention to one. And so we can think of this also in terms of the way we walk on the earth. So when we walk on the earth, we are walking on the surface. And we feel like everything that's above the ground is our world. And what's above the ground feels most real to us. But we know that beneath the surface, the soil goes down in layers and layers, and beneath those layers there's soil, there's gravel, and there's water, and there's bedrock, and there's magma. And all of those are just as real. They are not less real because we don't see them. And once in a while we feel what's happening at those levels. When there's an earthquake, we're feeling that movement deep below. The same is true of our own beings. So we have the surface level of conscious awareness, but our consciousness goes to much greater depths. And the depths that our consciousness go into the depths of everything, go into the depths of the world. And the same is true of what we think of as reality. And so John Moriarty said, this world and the other world are part of one great world. So most of the time we experience ourselves in what we think of as the ordinary world. But that doesn't mean that all the other worlds aren't present at the same time. And it doesn't mean that what happens in one world doesn't influence the others. And so in coming into this reorientation into our web of relation with the wild world, and coming into the memory that we are also related to our ancestors, human and wild, because we have wild ancestors too. We evolved from other forms of life. We then begin to expand our awareness, and when we expand our awareness, we can feel more of our kinship with everything, and we can begin thinking outside the narrow constraints of our cultural logic to find other ways of understanding. And to me, what we call myth and what we call poetry, what we call the mythic, to me, is another depth of being, just like another layer of the soil, one that's between us and the deepest layer of everything. And poetry and story are ways that we express that in language that makes some sense in this world. And so paying attention to all of this, paying attention in a different way, coming from a place primarily of relation, and a place of relation is a place of curiosity and a place of listening, we begin to change everything.
Is there a time, like Beltane, we talk about going down to the fairyland and stuff, and Samhain, the veil is getting thinner. Is there any kind of time in the months or the days that it's easier to get more in touch with the otherworld rather?
Absolutely. And so these two times that you mentioned are very significant in that way. So in the old Irish understanding of the year, there were two halves of the year. There is the dark half of the year that begins at Samhain, and that's the beginning of the year, because everything begins in darkness, because everything begins in the womb. And so, and we can actually see this in the physical reality of our world, that the leaves have fallen from the trees. The fruit and the seed has fallen to the ground and is finding its way into that place of incubation. And the trees have sent their energy, their life force, their intelligence down into their roots. And so everything is moving downward. And when that whole downward motion was happening in the forest and in the field, people understood that it was time for them to turn downward and inward as well, and began to pay deep attention. And so in the culture of my Irish ancestors, Samhain was incredibly important because it was the time when all of the focus was going toward that dark underworld, that place of beginnings and endings, that place that was at once the womb and the tomb. And in that moment, everything was closer. And so you could understand the dead as being present. And I've come over the past year to realize that if our ancestors are present to us at Samhain, we are also present to our descendants at their Samhain fires, and their Samhain rites, if they're calling back to us and remembering us. But actually, they can be a source of guidance for us too, as we can ask them to sing a little bit louder the stories of how it was that we made it through this time when it seemed like there was no way forward. And because that's true, all the beings of all the worlds are closer together at that time. And the she realm, the fairy realm, and the realm of the dead were considered to be almost one and the same traditionally in Irish culture. The different distinction being that the ones who were thought of as being of the she realm were ones who had, while they were in this world, developed the magics of moving between worlds, and so continued to hold that ability after they had died. And then at the opposite end of the year, at Beltane, that's when all of the life that poured from this world into the other world begins flowing back upward into the world again. And so Beltane was marked by the time that the hawthorn and the blackthorn would go into bloom. And it's fascinating because the hawthorn and the blackthorn have these white flowers, and white is the color of the other world, because when we're in this world, the color of our life is red, because that's the red is the oxygenation of the blood. When the oxygen and the blood leave the body, it grows pale and white. And so white is the color of the other world. And so these white blossoms that come beginning of May, that signal the flowing of life back into this world, are the color of the other world, because that's where the life is coming from. That's where it's flowing up. And so these are times when it's especially easy to reach across those veils, to see through that mist, to be in contact with the other world. In the same way, dawn and dusk, being those liminal times between darkness and light, have a similar power. And there are certain kinds of places that do. Certainly the deep forest has that power. The presence of very old stones has that power. The presence of wild waters, of springs that rise from the earth, and of very old wells, and of deep lakes, and of rivers in the place where they're close to their source, has that quality. And so does any place where anything grows that wasn't planted by human hands.
I've got a silly question, but it's not silly. But it just popped into my head. It's important to connect with plants. It's important to connect with ancestors. Now, I have ancestors, an altar. Can we do the same with plants? Can we make altars from plants?
Absolutely. And so just as with an ancestor altar, you would have images and objects that call to mind the essence of that being. So when I think of when I make an ancestor altar, if I have a picture of the ancestor, I'll put a picture of the ancestor there. And when I'm making offerings, I will find things that would be meaningful and enjoyable to that ancestor, very often food or drink.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll choose the colors that go with their essence and find symbolic objects that make me think about aspects of their being. And so, yeah, we can do the same thing with a plant, with an animal, with any being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people sometimes have to see something to get into it. Some people can just think about it in your brain and we can make it happen. But, it's like doing something on the web, and then if you're going to buy something on a real store kind of thing, some people need to see it first, and it's just kind of difficult, I think, for people to kind of change what we've gotten into. And sometimes that's not very good,
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And there's also an aspect in which an outward action changes our inward reality and changes our quality of focus and our quality of experience. And so it's like when I go to speak with the hawthorn, I bring honey or whiskey or cream, sometimes all three, and I leave them as an offering for the tree. I don't know one way or another what the hawthorn thinks of Irish whiskey, or of honey, or of milk for that matter. But I do know that the hawthorn would respond differently if I went and poured a can of Coca-Cola than if I brought in whiskey and milk. And it would respond differently still if I didn't bring anything and just sort of said, "Oh, well, I'm thinking about what I would have brought you." And I'm not, and it's because I am showing up differently. The way in which I am open and present when I have taken the time to put together that offering and bring it and place it with the hawthorn changes the way that I'm showing up. And the way that I'm showing up absolutely matters to the hawthorn.
Where do the plant spirits come into view? Because, we can feel them, but they can feel us, and that would be works both ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it works both ways at a physiological level as well. So it's like we think of a plant as having a fixed chemistry. But if we think about our own bodies, we can already realize that doesn't make sense. If we say, how much cortisol does a human have? Well, it depends on the human, depends on the situation. And the same is true for the constituent of any particular plant. And so when I'm with a plant, I am breathing things out, and I am excreting, and there's my sweat, there's my breath, there's my presence. The plant is taking that into its body. Its chemistry is changing in response. And then what it puts out into the world come to my body and changes, and my body changes in response as well. So it's a whole chemical conversation.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, people really have to get the book. I mean, there's just so much in there that we overlook, you know, the simple things, and it's I hope this is a good start, you know, for people to kind of like brush themselves up and make life easier. Yeah. Okay, you know what? This time goes by so fast. So quickly, could you tell everybody about your where to find you, actually, the books, the website?
Absolutely. So my website is otherworldwell.com. And through the website, you can find information about how to find the book, which you can also ask your favorite bookseller for. I love supporting small booksellers.
Yes.
And you can find information about the weekly online classes that I do on Sunday night, which people can take part in live or receive recordings of afterward, and about how to set up a consultation with me so I can help you figure out some ways to connect with the plants and the ancestors who want to connect with you.
And you've got newsletters, you've got blogs, but what kind of consultation, basically, how do you do that? Go about that?
So it varies so much from person to person. We come together over Zoom or phone and spend time together, starting with what it is that you want to shift in your life. And then I reach out to the plants and reach out to the ancestors, and we come together around practices for you to make those connections.
Well, there's two schools you've got, the Otherworld Wellhedge, and then there's another one that you do with somebody else.
Yes, the wonderful herbalist Matthew Wood has been kind enough to invite me to often co-teach classes with him. And so the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism is another place that I teach.
All right. Well, you know, we only touched a little bit of what we're doing here, but I hope people are listening. And again, get the book, go to the classes, get over to the website because that's important. And Sean, thank you for taking the time to teach us a thing or two. I hope we got
thank you so much.
And we got to also thank everybody who's listening to the podcast. And until next time, everybody, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Stirring the Cauldrons Masterclass. Please join us on the last Thursday of the month at the same time for another great class and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2024. The Holiday Weasel by Kevin MacLeod is licensed through Incompetech.